Most people believe recessions are natural events, like storms that come and go on their own. But the truth is much darker. Modern recessions are engineered. They're built deliberately, step by step, long before the public ever feels the pain. And the blueprint always starts with control over money, because whoever creates the money controls the economy. The next recession began not with a crash, but with years of artificially low interest rates. Central banks flooded the economy with cheap money, encouraging governments, corporations, and households to borrow more than ever before. This wasn't an accident, it was the trap. When borrowing becomes easy, spending surges, asset prices inflate, and people feel wealthier than they actually are. It's the perfect setup for a future collapse. Then comes phase two, pulling the liquidity back. The same institutions that pumped cheap money into the system slowly begin raising interest rates. Suddenly, the debt that felt harmless becomes unbearable. Mortgages spike, credit card bills explode, companies can't refinance their loans, and governments struggle to pay interest on their own debt. The pressure rises silently, like water behind a dam. Next, financial markets start to break. Stock bubbles, real estate bubbles, tech bubbles, all inflated by years of cheap credit, begin to wobble. Investors panic. Banks tighten lending. Confidence evaporates. The system begins to freeze. But here's the key. This cycle is not random. It's a manufactured rhythm that transfers wealth from the public to the elite. Ordinary people lose homes, jobs, savings, and stability. Meanwhile, the same institutions that engineered the collapse start buying discounted assets, gaining control over industries, land, and resources. This is the blueprint of collapse: inflate, withdraw, crash, consolidate. And right now, the next engineered recession is already deep in motion. Every recession has a spark, but that spark is never random. It comes from a set of predictable trigger points that insiders watch closely, and that most ordinary people never notice until it's too late. These trigger points are already building pressure in the global economy, and together they form the perfect recipe for the next engineered collapse. The first trigger is exploding national debt. Countries around the world have borrowed more money than any generation before them. The U.S. alone is crossing levels of debt that mathematically cannot be repaid. As interest rates rise, governments must spend more on paying interest than on public services, defense, or infrastructure. That imbalance is unsustainable, and it forces governments to choose between default, inflation, or financial repression. All three lead to crisis. The second trigger is consumer debt, especially in the form of credit cards, auto loans, and student loans. For years, households have been encouraged to borrow beyond their limits. Now, millions of Americans are sitting on debts they can't afford, and delinquencies are already rising. This weakens consumer spending, the backbone of the U.S. economy. The third trigger is corporate fragility. Many large companies borrowed heavily when interest rates were near zero. Those loans must now be refinanced at much higher rates. This will push weak companies into bankruptcy and force stronger ones to slash jobs, creating a domino effect across the economy. The fourth trigger is the asset bubble era. Housing, stocks, crypto, tech, everything inflated by cheap money. Once confidence cracks, these bubbles will burst simultaneously, erasing trillions in perceived wealth. Finally, there's the geopolitical trigger: global instability, supply chain breakdowns, trade wars, and energy shocks. These external stresses can turn a fragile economy into a collapsing one almost overnight. Together, these levers form the ignition system for a recession that was designed long before it arrives. Recessions are often described as universal disasters, events where everyone suffers together. But that's not true. While ordinary people lose jobs, homes, savings, and stability, a small and powerful group quietly gains more wealth, more influence, and more control. These are the silent architects of every economic collapse, and recessions are not setbacks for them. They are opportunities. At the top of this hidden hierarchy are central banks, the entities that literally control the flow of money. When a recession hits, central banks swoop in with emergency programs, printing money, lowering rates, and buying assets. But this doesn't rescue the public. Instead, it pumps cheap liquidity into financial markets, allowing large investors to buy assets, stocks, companies, real estate, at massive discounts. Ordinary people are forced to sell, elites are waiting to buy. Next are the global investment funds, massive institutions like BlackRock, Vanguard, and private equity giants. These firms have trillions in capital and thrive in chaos. During downturns, they purchase collapsing companies, distressed properties, and failing industries for pennies on the dollar. When the economy recovers, they own more of the world than before. Then we have shadow banking networks, hedge funds, insurance giants, offshore capital pools, entities that most people don't even know exist. These groups profit from volatility. They make money when things rise, but they make even more when things crash. Their goal is not stability, it's movement. The more extreme the crisis, the larger their returns. Megacorporations also benefit enormously. Small and mid-sized businesses often cannot survive recessions, giving larger companies the chance to eliminate competition and seize entire markets. Every crash leads to greater corporate consolidation and more power centralized at the top. In the end, recessions act like controlled burns in a forest. The old growth is cleared away, but only to make room for the tallest trees to stretch even higher. The crash that devastates the many is the strategy that enriches the few. When the next engineered recession hits, it won't just shake financial markets. It will permanently reshape how people live, work, spend, and interact with the economy. Crashes aren't just economic resets, they're social resets. And the everyday consequences are far more dramatic than most people realize. The first major shift will be in employment. As companies collapse or downsize, millions will lose jobs, particularly in retail, hospitality, transportation, and non-essential services. But this time, unlike past recessions, many of those jobs will never come back. Corporations will use the crisis to replace human labor with automation, AI, and robotics. A recession becomes the perfect excuse to cut costs and modernize, even if it means eliminating entire categories of workers permanently. The second shift will be the disappearance of small businesses. Local shops, independent restaurants, family-owned suppliers. These businesses operate on razor-thin margins. Most won't survive the downturn. In their place, giant chains and tech-owned delivery platforms will take over, turning communities into corporate franchises. Housing will undergo the third transformation. As people lose income, foreclosures and evictions will surge. Investment funds will be waiting to buy distressed homes in bulk, converting them into rentals and pushing homeownership further out of reach. A generation that once dreamed of owning property may become a permanent renter class. Then comes the digital tightening. During economic crises, governments introduce new surveillance tools to prevent fraud or stabilize the system. Expect more digital IDs, more central bank digital currency tests, and more tracking of transactions. Convenience will be the marketing pitch, but control will be the outcome. Finally, the cultural atmosphere will shift. People will become more cautious, more dependent on government relief, and more distrustful of institutions. The middle class will shrink further, polarizing society into those who own assets and those who rent everything. The post-crash world won't look like a recovery. It will look like a reordering, a new hierarchy built on who controlled the chaos. The idea that recessions are natural or inevitable has been repeated for decades, but when you look closely, the same groups benefit every time, and the same populations suffer. So the real question becomes, can this cycle ever be broken? The answer isn't simple, but it starts with understanding how the system actually works. First, the cycle continues because most people don't see it happening until it's too late. Economic manipulation relies on confusion, fear, and complexity. As long as the public believes recessions are unpredictable accidents, the architects behind them can operate freely. Breaking the cycle means exposing those patterns: monetary manipulation, coordinated rate hikes, artificial tightening, and the use of crises to push major policy changes. Second, decentralization is key. The more the world depends on a handful of megabanks, central banks, and tech-driven financial platforms, the easier it is to engineer downturns. Alternatives like decentralized finance, community banking, and diversified global trade reduce the concentration of power that makes crashes profitable for a few. Third, transparency is essential. Hidden bailouts, off-book lending, secret derivatives, and shadow banking networks must be brought into the open. Crashes thrive in darkness. They weaken when the public understands the mechanisms behind them. Finally, people must recognize the truth. As long as crises benefit the powerful will keep manufacturing crises. Breaking the cycle requires a shift from reactive panic to proactive awareness. Once people understand the blueprint, the illusion collapses, and the engineered crash loses its power.